If this story touches you in any way, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. There's a lot of good things coming here. On that sultry late spring morning, Don Ramon Aguirre arrived early at the Central University. He wore his inseparable, already sun-bleached straw hat, his plaid shirt buttoned up to the neck, and boots covered in red dust, a reminder of the land he knew like no one else. He carried with him only a small hardcover notebook in which he jotted down reflections, crop calculations, and crude sketches of mechanisms that, with his calloused hands, he built on the farm. At 64, Don Ramon was not a man of many words, but his eyes carried something hard to describe, a mixture of peace and firmness that unsettled anyone trying to decipher him just by his appearance. His invitation to attend the lecture had been an almost ceremonial gesture, offered by a visiting professor who had come to know his work at an agricultural fair. No one expected him to actually come, but he did. The auditorium was spacious, modern, and exuded that cold, artificial air of air-conditioned environments. Students with open laptops, professors in their sharply tailored suits, technicians adjusting projectors. Everything in that space seemed to revolve around precision, technical language, and the symbols of traditional science. When Don Ramon entered, there was a brief, curious silence, followed by contained whispers and discreet, judgmental glances. He chose a discreet seat in the third row and sat as if watching the rain fall on the cornfield, unhurried, merely attentive. He did not seem out of place, only different. And it was exactly this difference that began to unsettle the conference's host, the prestigious and feared Dr. Ernesto Salinas, known as much for his brilliance as for his ego, the size of a planetarium. Dr. Ernesto Salinas walked across the stage with the same presence of someone used to being the center of attention. His hands gesticulated with surgical precision, his rectangular glasses subtly slid down his sharp nose, and his deep voice resonated authoritatively with each citation of theories and foreign names. To many there, he was the ultimate symbol of formal knowledge, the type of man who did not hesitate to correct a student mid-sentence, who took pride in countering questions with even more complex ones. His lecture followed the usual script: formulas projected on the screen, three-dimensional graphs, references to the great physicists of history, until upon noticing Don Ramon seated among the audience, the professor interrupted his speech. First, he made a comment disguised as a joke, a quip about how even the countryside now seems interested in theoretical physics. The auditorium laughed, albeit awkwardly. But when they noticed that the farmer did not even show a reaction, Salinas seemed incited. That unpretentious calm challenged him more than any poorly reviewed scientific paper. Then, in a gesture that seemed spontaneous, yet carried the precise intent to humiliate, Salinas looked at Don Ramon and issued a challenge. He said that if the man with the straw hat was truly curious about science, he could try to solve a small problem. It was a complex equation, filled with integrals and variables that would make any freshman break into a cold sweat. The equation was projected on the big screen and explained with an air of superiority, as if laying an intellectual trap. Some students laughed, others watched attentively, curious to see the outcome of that provocation. Don Ramon remained motionless for a few seconds. Then he calmly stood up, walked to the whiteboard, and pen in hand began to write. His strokes were firm, sure, as if drawing the contours of a freshly plowed field. In a few minutes, before an audience in absolute silence, he presented the solution. Clear, exact, direct. The environment, previously filled with stifled laughter, was overtaken by a strange sense of disbelief. Salinas forced a bitter smile, but his eyes already betrayed his discomfort. For a few seconds, no one moved. The entire room seemed frozen, as if time had suspended its logic before what had just happened. The farmer, with his serene expression, simply returned the pen to its holder and went back to his seat with the same naturalness of someone returning to the veranda after checking if the rain would fall on the corn. There was no arrogance in his gestures, nor any haughtiness, just a tranquility that contrasted brutally with the perplexity on Salinas's face. The professor tried to regain control of the situation with a sarcastic remark, suggesting that Don Ramon had memorized the solution from somewhere, as if it could not have come from himself. But not even his voice managed to sustain the usual tone of superiority. It trembled subtly, betraying that something within him had been shaken. Unsettled by the audience's reaction, who now exchanged surprised glances, some with a contained smile of admiration for the unexpected visitor, Salinas decided to double down. He said that this had been just an introductory exercise and that anyone with a good hunch could, by chance, get it right. Then he proposed another challenge, this time more abstract, involving advanced concepts of quantum physics and vector calculus. There was a tension in the air, as if everyone knew that the professor did not want to teach, but to win. But Don Ramon once again stood up without hesitation. Before picking up the pen, however, he looked at the professor and said something that disarmed part of the arrogance in the room. "Science does not only live on paper, Doctor. It also lives where we walk every day." And then, instead of solving the formal equation, he began to explain the concept behind the problem, using an analogy with rainwater flowing down the curves of the terrain. And everything, absolutely everything, made sense. While Don Ramon spoke, the silence in the auditorium became almost palpable. It was not an empty silence, but one of attentive, almost reverent listening. He explained that in the countryside, everything obeys its own kind of logic, that water does not run where one wants, but where the land allows, that the ox learns to conserve energy in its step, that the shade of trees teaches about time and movement, and that the cycles of nature do not need formulas to work with precision. His speech was simple, yet surprisingly rich. He did not use technical terms, but built bridges between the knowledge of the land and the concepts of physics with a clarity that no projected graph could ever achieve. Even the most skeptical students found themselves forced to pay attention. For the first time, many seemed to truly understand something that before they only repeated to pass exams. Salinas, uneasy, tried to interrupt. He argued that this was just a poetic interpretation, a rudimentary way of thinking about science, but with each attempt, Don Ramon answered with another image drawn from real life, about the flight of birds, the thrust of plows, the weight of stones, the timing of harvests. Unknowingly, the professor was being led into a territory where his usual tools no longer served, and that deeply bothered him. The man who for so many years had felt untouchable in his academic authority now found himself disarmed before the wisdom of someone who had never stepped into a formal classroom. And the most disconcerting part was the audience's reaction. Students, once hypnotized by the brilliant slides and indecipherable equations, now leaned forward, absorbing every word from that farmer who seemed to see the world with different eyes. Then, in a mix of impatience and despair, Salinas decided to launch a new challenge. This time, it was not about a specific equation or concept, but a practical demonstration. He grabbed a glass from the table and with theatrical air held it up before the audience. He said that if Don Ramon was so wise with his countryside metaphors, then he should predict the exact spot on the floor where the glass would break if it were thrown off the stage. There was a tone of mockery, but also a trace of disguised nervousness. The challenge was clearly an attempt to expose a limit, to reaffirm his authority in the face of a knowledge he could not control. The audience, now divided between embarrassment and anticipation, waited in silence. Don Ramon looked calmly at the stage, then slowly walked to the center, where the professor was holding the glass. He only asked that he be allowed to observe the environment for a moment. He walked from one side to the other, examining the floor, the level of the stage, the inclination of the boards, the shape of the glass, even the position of the professor's hand. He did this as if inspecting a field before the harvest, attentive to the details that no one else noticed. Then, he pointed to a specific spot on the floor, near one of the front rows. He said confidently, "If you let it go with that angle, the glass will hit first there, spin, and break right here." The professor laughed, feigning disdain, and released the glass. The sound of the glass striking the floor echoed through the room. First a dry tap, then the spin, and finally the shattering, exactly at the indicated spot. A murmur took over the auditorium, followed by spontaneous applause, timid at first but soon spreading throughout the room. Salinas remained, still, with a lost expression, unable to hide his embarrassment. Inside, Salinas waged a silent war. It wasn't just the error in front of the audience that was gnawing at him. It was the fact that, for the first time in many years, he felt small within his own discipline. Something in that simple, calm man dismantled his deepest certainties. Don Ramon did not humiliate him with harsh words, nor with direct confrontations, but with a presence that said everything without needing to prove anything. With every metaphor, every answer, every explanation coming from the field, the professor found himself more distant from that image of the absolute master he had cultivated for so long. He tried to rationalize, telling himself that it was all coincidence, chance, luck. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more he felt the weight of doubt. And doubt, for someone like him, was a slow poison, especially when it came not from an academic rival, but from someone who had never roamed the corridors of the university. Meanwhile, the students looked at Don Ramon with genuine, almost affectionate curiosity. That figure who at first caused strangeness was now seen with respect and admiration. Some wrote down his words as if they were excerpts from a rare book. Others simply observed in silence, absorbing something that did not come from formulas, but from a way of seeing the world. For the first time, many there understood that learning was not just about memorizing structures and solving equations. It was also about knowing how to observe, feel, and interpret the subtle movements of life. And that lesson was not in the curriculum of any course. It was something that could only be learned by listening to someone like Don Ramon. The contrast was striking. On one side, knowledge that demands titles and diplomas. On the other, understanding that springs from experience and attentive observation. And that, gradually, began to change the mood in the auditorium. Less formal, more human. Behind the scenes in his mind, Salinas tried to find arguments that would re-establish his position. He rummaged through his knowledge in search of something irrefutable, a final trump card that could reaffirm his technical superiority. But no matter how hard he tried, everything seemed ineffective in the face of the blunt simplicity of what he had witnessed. And what tormented him the most was the fact that Don Ramon had never tried to compete with him. On the contrary, at no moment did he show any desire to prove that he was better, smarter, or superior. He only shared what he knew, and he did so with a disarming naturalness, as if he did not carry the weight of the ego that for so long had warped the professor's steps. It was at that point that something began to stir, still timid, deep within Salinas's pride. A restlessness different from the usual, a silent desire to understand how that man could see the world so clearly without following the paths that he considered indispensable. For his part, Don Ramon showed no sign of vanity. Even amid the applause, he kept his feet firmly on the ground, as if he knew that true wisdom did not need to be applauded to exist. He did not seek approval, nor did he want recognition. He simply spoke as he always had, in the way he had learned through the years, with the seasons, with the errors of parched earth, and the victories of bountiful harvests. At one point, a female student raised her hand and, visibly moved, asked how he managed to understand so much without ever having attended a university. Don Ramon smiled with his eyes and replied, "Because life teaches all the time. You just have to want to listen." And at that moment, it was not only the room that fell silent, it was also Salinas's ego, which for the first time felt small in the face of such a simple yet impossible to refute phrase. Salinas sat down for a moment, as if he needed to reorganize his own thoughts. For the first time in years, he was not the one commanding the room's attention. The feeling was strange, disconcerting. The same sparkle in the student's eyes when he spoke was no longer there. That sparkle now belonged to Don Ramon, and that affected him more than he cared to admit. Still, he tried to maintain his posture as if he were merely a neutral observer of what was happening. But inside, his mind was buzzing. He began to remember the times he had ridiculed simple questions from students, colleagues who abandoned discussions because of his arrogance, lectures where he seemed to be talking to himself rather than teaching someone. He had never questioned his way of teaching because he believed that knowing a lot gave him the right to be that way. But now, facing a man without a degree who taught better than he ever had, that thought began to crumble. And if this story has made you reflect even a little, please share it with someone who also needs to hear it. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe. That really helps. In an attempt to regain some control, Salinas asked for the floor again, but this time his tone had changed. He was still the same man, with his deep voice and lofty posture, but something in the cadence of his sentences seemed more cautious, almost humble. He said he wanted to propose one last exercise, but that this time it would not be a challenge for Don Ramon. It would be a joint challenge. The proposal was simple. Take any physical concept and explain it together. He with scientific language, Don Ramon with the language of life. There was a brief silence in the auditorium, followed by some curious murmurs. Don Ramon looked at the professor with a firm but respectful gaze and simply nodded. And in that gesture, as silent as it was symbolic, began something that no one there expected to see. Two worlds, once opposed, trying to meet on the same stage. The chosen concept was Newton's third law, action and reaction. Salinas began explaining in the way he always had, with formulas, vector graphs, examples involving masses and forces. His explanation was correct, clear, but it sounded distant, almost cold. It was the kind of content that required concentration to be absorbed, the kind of lecture that, although technically impeccable, rarely inspired wonder. When he finished, he handed the floor to Don Ramon, who in turn slowly walked to the center of the stage and began to speak about the weight of hands on the plow. He said that when the ox pushes the earth also responds, sometimes hard, sometimes soft, depending on the weather and the care given to it, and that every force applied in one corner of life returns along another path, like a hoe that turns against the one who does not hold it properly. The explanation was almost poetic, but it wasn't poetry, it was practical, it was truth. And, in a surprising way, it made Newton's theory clearer than any slide ever could. The audience reacted with astonishment and delight. Students who before saw formulas as obstacles began to make mental connections with everyday scenes. Professors murmured among themselves, visibly moved by that teaching style as unlikely as it was effective. Salinas, standing next to Don Ramon, watched in silence. And for the first time, he no longer felt threatened by the other's wisdom. He felt in some way completed by it. It was as if, in that brief moment, he understood that his language did not need to be discarded. It just needed to learn to coexist with other ways of teaching. Deep down, he was beginning to understand that the true role of a teacher is not to shine alone, but to make others see the light too. And that realization, although painful at first, gradually freed him from the armor he had carried for decades. At the end of the joint explanation, there was a different kind of silence in the auditorium, not the uncomfortable silence from before, nor the silence of anticipation, but that good silence of someone digesting something profound. No one rushed to applaud. It was as if everyone knew they had witnessed something too rare to be interrupted by hasty applause. When the first gestures of approval finally came, they were not loud, but intense. The students' eyes shone with something new, something that came not only from the learned content, but from the way they had learned. Don Ramon, without noticing, had touched a place that formal education rarely reached, the heart of understanding. And Salinas, observing all, this beside him, no longer felt anger or shame. He felt a kind of silent gratitude, as if he had been reminded of why he had chosen science so many years ago, before ego and degrees pulled him away from the essence. During the conference break, the corridors of the university buzzed with conversation. Students commented enthusiastically, professors discussed with attentive eyes, and even the technical staff of the organization talked about the episode as if it were a milestone. Some tried to label what they had witnessed: alternative class, empirical pedagogy, applied popular wisdom. But deep down, they knew that none of that fully explained what had happened there. It was greater than any theory or methodology. It was simply the unexpected meeting between two worlds that should never have been separated. While walking down the corridor, Salinas was approached by a young student who said, without beating around the bush, "Today was the first time I truly understood what physics is." The professor smiled, not with irony or superiority, but with a kind of smile he himself found strange, sincere, humble, almost moved, and inside, something in him was finally beginning to change definitively. On the return to the auditorium for the conference's closing, Salinas hesitated a few seconds before going back on stage. For the first time in years, he did not exactly know what to say. He could no longer occupy that space with the same automatic authority as before. It was as if something within him demanded a new posture, a new way of presenting himself to people. When he finally took the microphone, he looked for a moment at Don Ramon, who was still seated in the third row, exactly where he had been from the beginning. He took a deep breath, and instead of starting with a technical speech, he did something no one expected. He told a story. He spoke about his childhood in a small village, about the grandfather who taught him to observe the behavior of ants, about how that in some way had awakened his interest in physics long before he knew the name of the laws. It was the first time he allowed himself to be vulnerable before his students, and, curiously, it was also the first time that everyone listened to him in absolute silence, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Don Ramon watched him attentively, without vanity, just with that calm look of someone who already knows the cycles of life and understands when a season is changing. At the end of the speech, Salinas left the stage and walked toward him. He extended his hand and, in a firm voice, said, "You taught me more today than many books have taught me in decades." The gesture, simple and direct, carried immense weight for everyone there. It was not just a handshake, it was a silent apology, a belated acknowledgement, an opening to something new. Don Ramon shook his hand with quiet strength and simply replied, "Knowledge has no owner, Doctor. It only needs space to grow." Bizarre phrase echoed in the auditorium as a final lesson, simple, direct, impossible to forget. In the days that followed the conference, the episode between Salinas and Don Ramon spread through the university like a story no one wanted to forget. Students who had never truly been interested in the subject began to look at the concepts with different eyes. Professors from other fields started including discussions about empirical knowledge in their classes. The presence of that humble farmer had generated an unexpected effect, a shake-up in the rigid structure of traditional education. And contrary to what many had imagined, Salinas did not oppose this change. On the contrary, he seemed to be the first to embrace it. He began to review his own methods, listened more to the students, and asked questions instead of just giving answers. He did not change completely. He did not transform into another man, but something within him had shifted, like a river that changes its course after a heavy rain. Shortly afterward, Salinas sent a formal letter to the university rector requesting the inclusion of Don Ramon as a special guest at the next scientific conference, with the right to speak at the event's opening. The proposal generated surprise, praise, and of course some resistance. After all, there were still those who believed that knowledge was only legitimate if it came with a stamped diploma. But Salinas's letter was clear, firm, and above all, generous. In it, the professor wrote, "Knowledge that does not know how to listen is nothing more than disguised vanity." Don Ramon has something many of us have lost: the ability to learn from the world before trying to explain it. The repercussion was such that, a few days later, the rectorate officially confirmed the invitation. When Don Ramon received the news, he reacted as always, without euphoria, only with a slight smile, as if he already knew deep down that certain paths cross when they must, even if no one really understands why at first. Days before the new conference, Salinas decided to do something he had never imagined doing before. He visited Don Ramon on his property in the countryside. He arrived on a late afternoon, still wearing his slightly rumpled dress shirt and shoes full of red dust from the dirt road. Don Ramon received him with the same simplicity as always, as if welcoming an old friend from days gone by. They sat in the shade of an enormous jatoba tree, with two worn wooden chairs and freshly brewed coffee served in an enameled mug. Salinas, accustomed to formal environments and air-conditioned rooms, seemed out of place there, but strangely comfortable. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to prove anything. He just listened. Don Ramon talked about the crops, about the changing weather, about the difficulty of dealing with pests when the soil is tired. And every sentence, no matter how simple, carried more depth than many lectures he had attended in his entire life. At one point, Salinas looked out at the field and said, almost as a vent, "We spend so much time trying to explain everything, and sometimes we forget to feel." Don Ramon only nodded without saying anything. There was no need. There was a silent, mature understanding that dispensed with any response. It was as if on that piece of land, amid the dust, the smell of coffee, and the distant sound of a rooster, something essential had been restored within the professor. Before leaving, Salinas took a small notebook from his pocket and handed it to his host. "If you want to jot down your ideas for the next conference, feel free. The stage is yours now, too." Don Ramon took the notebook carefully, as if receiving a seedling of a rare plant. And in that simple gesture, they sealed a bond that no academic thesis could ever explain. The following conference was, without exaggeration, the most anticipated in recent years. The auditorium, usually frequented only by students from the field and a few interested professors, was packed this time. People were standing in the corridors, extra chairs hastily arranged, even students from other courses squeezed in to watch. Don Ramon was announced as the guest of honor, and when he took the stage, he was awaited in a way rarely seen in that environment. He wore the same plaid shirt, the same straw hat, and that same serene manner, as always. But now, his presence no longer caused strangeness. It commanded respect. Salinas made the opening, but unlike before, he spoke little. He only said that the stage was no longer a space for hierarchy, but for exchange, and, with a symbolic gesture, he ceded the center of the presentation to Don Ramon, even before finishing his speech. The gesture was simple, yet laden with meaning. It was, in a way, the final step of his transformation, publicly and unpretentiously acknowledging the value of a knowledge he had once despised. Don Ramon spoke as he always did, without haste, without jargon, without any effort to impress. But he impressed, and greatly so. Every explanation he gave, every story he told, was met with attentive eyes, notebooks being hastily filled, and cell phones recording the moments. He spoke of gravity by explaining the weight of a hoe forgotten on the ground, spoke of material resistance by showing how a piece of wood bends before breaking, spoke of time and space by recounting the changing winds through the seasons. And everything made sense, not because it followed scientific standards, but because it touched people's experience. In the end, there was a brief moment for questions, but no one wanted to test the farmer. Everyone just wanted to hear more. The university, without even realizing it, was learning to listen differently, and that was exactly what Don Ramon had come to teach. In the months that followed, something began to change, subtly but steadily, within the very structure of the university. A new project was created, named Saberes de Terra, Knowledges of the Earth, with periodic meetings between academics and people from the countryside, artisans, fishermen, midwives, and many other masters of practical life. The aim was not to romanticize popular knowledge, nor to replace formal education, but to build bridges where walls once existed. Salinas became one of the main coordinators of the initiative. He no longer spoke in that old, pompous tone. Now his speech was more measured, more open, more receptive. In the corridors, he was no longer just Dr. Salinas, but also the professor who learned from the farmer. And he accepted that title with a lightness that before would have been unthinkable. He had learned at last that teaching and learning are two sides of the same coin, and that true knowledge is the one that transforms, not merely impresses. Don Ramon returned to his routine on the farm, taking care of the crops, the chickens, the dogs, and the land. Life continued at its natural pace, and he never let fame pull him away from the ground from which he came. Sometimes he received visits from curious students, professors wanting to chat, young people eager to learn in a different way. He welcomed them with fresh coffee, a wooden bench, and stories told calmly. He never considered himself a master of anything. He only said that he knew how to pay attention, and perhaps that was exactly what made him so valuable in that auditorium. The man who once was a source of ridicule became a silent reference of wisdom. And even far from the lights and microphones, his presence continued to echo in the minds of those lucky enough to have listened to him. Because, deep down, everyone knew that day at the conference was not just a lesson. It was a reminder that knowledge lives in many places. You just have to have the humility to see it. The following year, during a new edition of the conference, a student, one of those restless and full of questions, approached Salinas at the end of his lecture and asked what, after all, had changed so much in him since the episode with Don Ramon. The professor was silent for a few seconds before answering. He looked at the auditorium, then at the floor, as if searching for the right words without haste. And then he said, "Before, I thought teaching was about talking. Today I know that teaching begins when we learn to listen." The student smiled, wrote down the phrase, and left. He might never have known how sincere it was. But for Salinas, it was enough to know that from then on, everyone who entered that classroom would have a greater chance of being heard, and not just evaluated. That was what mattered now. For his part, Don Ramon never wrote a book, nor did he hold an academic chair. But his stories and teachings continued to be passed down through generations, told by those privileged enough to have listened to him. Many still speak of him as a kind of living legend, yet he himself would laugh about it when he heard. "I'm just a man from the countryside," he used to say. And perhaps he truly was. But it was this man from the countryside who, without any pretension, taught one of the most valuable lessons a university could learn: that knowledge is not a trophy to be displayed, but a seed, and that it only blossoms where there is humility to nurture it. And from that day on, no matter how the world kept spinning as always, nothing was ever exactly the same. If this story moved you as much as it moved us to tell it, leave your like, share it with those who value true knowledge, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.